When you think of female serial killers, the first person who comes to mind is Aileen Wuornos. Her recognizable mugshot and cracked smile have become the gold standard of female evil the world over.
Cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere.
Her story has been told in numerous books, movies, documentaries, but in this video, we compiled everything about first female serial killer in the history of America. Aileen Wuornos' childhood was a series of tragedies, all of which made for ideal conditions to birth a future serial killer. She was born on February 29, 1956, in Troy, Michigan, to parents Diane Wuornos and Leo Pittman. Aileen was raised solely by her mother, Diane, who gave birth to Aileen when she was only 17. At the time of her birth, Diane already had a 2-year-old son, and the struggle of raising 2 young children, while only a teenager herself, proved too much for her. Diane abandoned her children in 1960, leaving them in the care of their maternal grandparents. Aileen's father, Leo, had a history of violence and was incarcerated for child molestation before Aileen was born, so the two never met. When Aileen was 13, Leo committed suicide in his prison cell. Aileen was unaware that she was living with her grandparents, and for many years believed that they were actually her real mother and father. But like her real parents, her grandparents were abusive towards the young Aileen and her brother. They were both subject to regular beatings and lashings at the hands of her grandfather, who also sexually abused Aileen as she got older. When Aileen was 14, her grandmother passed away from liver failure, less than a year after her real father committed suicide, leaving her solely in the hands of her violent grandfather, after sometimes her grandfather drove her out of the house. Aileen was naturally confused about sexual relationships, and during high school, she began to engage in prostitution. She offered sexual favors to boys around school in exchange for money, cigarettes, and drugs. There were also reports that she began a sexual relationship with her own brother. In 1970, when Aileen was only 14 years old, she was raped and impregnated by a friend of her grandfather's. She gave birth to a baby boy when she was 15, who was immediately placed up for adoption. The identity and whereabouts of Aileen Wuornos' son have never been discovered. For 18 years, Aileen's life had been endless chaos, but things only got worse as she became an adult. She was arrested for DUI, shooting a firearm and disorderly conduct in 1974, around which time she began hitchhiking across the United States. She ended up in Florida, where she met a retired businessman named Louis Fell, who was 50 years her senior. The two quickly married. Aileen could have had an easy life alongside her wealthy husband, but instead, she continued to involve herself in petty crime and bar violence around Daytona Beach, Florida. In only a few short weeks into their marriage, Fell took out a restraining order against Aileen, who had attacked him with his own walking cane. After just 9 weeks, Fell and Wuornos annulled their marriage. Drink, drugs, and violence was all Aileen knew. She was arrested in 1976 for disturbing the peace after attacking a bartender with a pool cue. Shortly after, Aileen's brother died of throat cancer, aged just 21. She received an inheritance from him of $10,000, which she spent in 2 months. Wuornos continued her life of prostitution and theft for the next 10 years, accruing charges for armed robbery, forgery, car theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. Several times, police pulled Wuornos over to find her in the possession of a number of weapons. She served a prison sentence of 13 months in 1982 for armed robbery of a local store, being released in June 1983 and immediately going back to her criminal ways. Things changed when she met a woman named Tyria Moore at a local gay bar in Daytona Beach. It seemed that finally, Wuornos had found the love she'd always wanted. The two began a romantic relationship and moved around Florida together, living on the streets and out of motel rooms. Wuornos claimed that she stayed in love with Moore right up until her last days, despite her still engaging in prostitution while the two were together. Moore warned Wuornos of the dangers of her lifestyle, but Wuornos continued her reckless ways regardless. It seemed that bar violence and armed robbery weren't enough for Wuornos anymore, and beginning in November 1989, she went on a 12-month reign of terror, culminating in the murders of 7 men. Her first victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old who had enlisted Aileen's prostitution services. She claimed that Mallory was abusive, tying her hands to his steering wheel and attacking her. Aileen managed to pry herself free and pull out her .22 pistol from her purse, then shot Mallory 3 times. She then drove him to the nearby woods and dumped his body. Similar incidents played out 6 more times over the next year. Wuornos's killing spree ended in November 1990. 4 months before, both Wuornos and Moore had been seen driving one of the victims' cars. As Wuornos was already a known felon, her fingerprints were on file, and police were able to match them with fingerprints discovered in the abandoned cars of the victims. It took 2 months for police to finally locate Wuornos after an extensive search. She was found in a bar in Volusia County on January 9th, 1991, where she was arrested on an outstanding warrant for violent behavior. By this point, Moore had already fled to Pennsylvania, having ended her relationship with Wuornos. Police apprehended her on January 10th. Now, with both Wuornos and Moore in custody, police devised a plan to elicit a confession out of Wuornos for the murders. In exchange for her cooperation, Moore received immunity from any kind of prosecution, which Wuornos was unaware of. Moore continued to cooperate with police and took the stand to testify against her former lover in court. Throughout the whole trial, it was reported that Moore never once made eye contact with Wuornos.
Who betrayed her to the police.
We were sitting on the floor watching TV, and she just come out and said, "I have something to tell you." And I asked her what, and she said that she had shot and killed a man that day.
For each murder, Wuornos claimed that she acted in self-defense when her clients tried to attack and rape her. However, her conversations with Moore painted a different story. While there was no doubt that several of the killings were indeed acts of self-defense, her first victim, Richard Mallory, had a history of rape convictions. It was likely that several of them were committed via different motivations. On some occasions, she claimed that she was trying to rob her victims, but ended up shooting them to avoid leaving witnesses. This is further backed up by the fact that Wuornos stole some of her victims' possessions and pawned them off. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to absolve her of her crimes, and on January 31st, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was given the death penalty. She was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder, resulting in a total of 6 death sentences. During her incarceration, Wuornos's mental state began to deteriorate. She believed that prison staff were tampering with her food, filling it with spit and urine. She believed they were trying to coerce her into committing suicide by making her cell conditions worse than other inmates. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed. She declined her last meal, instead opting for a cup of coffee. Her last words to the world were a promise that she'd return after death. "I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. I'll be back." During filming the documentaries, filmmaker Nick Broomfield was told some interesting things by Wuornos in relation to her murders. Wuornos claimed during her trial, "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I'm so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." But during a moment when Wuornos thought the cameras were off, she told Broomfield that every murder was an act of self-defense. But she told the court a different story because she couldn't stand the idea of being on death row for so long. She hated the prison system and just wanted to be executed. Just one day before her execution, Wuornos was interviewed by Broomfield to give her final thoughts. She spends 22 minutes criticizing the police, the prison system, and the media.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I lost my fucking life because of it. Couldn't even get a fair trial. Couldn't even get a fair investigation or nothing. Couldn't even have my appeals right. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot. You're an inhumane bunch of fucking living bastards and bitches, and you're gonna get your asses nuked in the end. And pretty soon it's coming. 2019, a rock's supposed to hit you anyhow. You're all gonna get nuked.